Serious, what are some weird or interesting facts about your families? My great-grandfather saved my life, even though he died 89 years before I was born. He was a semi-well-known medical researcher, enough for a Wikipedia page and a family of bacteria to be named after him, who ended up dying after being crazy enough to inject himself with one of the diseases he was studying. 100-ish years down the line, I caught one of the diseases that he studied. His research had paved the cure of that and a few other serious diseases. My great-uncle disappeared after Vietnam. He killed his best friend playing with a gun when he was a kid and hadn't been the same after. Had a bit of a death wish. Vietnam had made him even more morose and withdrawn, so when he vanished, the family just assumed the worst and figured he had gone and committed suicide or gotten himself killed one way or another. 20 years later, come to find out, he had moved to Mexico and started a family. My grandmother got a call from his teenage daughter, letting us know he had passed away. Stomach cancer. Nobody had any idea. Dude just lit out and severed ties without saying a word. Killed his best friend and having to deal with American public post-Vietnam War. I can't imagine how someone with a lot of emotional baggage would not want to return home. My wife's family is the coolest freaking family ever. My wife is directly related to Marco Polo. Her family has deep roots in Italy and Sicily. Her mother's side of the family almost all have the last name Polo, including her own mother. They actually showed me the lineage pretty far back, with surprisingly few unknown areas in the family tree. Her great-grandfather was actually kicked out of his small town in southern Italy for being in the Italian Mafia. Yes, they raised money to send him to America from Italy in the early 20th century to get rid of the patriarch of their mob. You think that's all the Mafia in her family? Ha 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 ha. No, it gets worse. On her mother's side of the family there are also Cubans. Specifically, the Cuban cigar mafia in Cuba and Florida. Her grandmother has grainy old pictures from her days as a Cuban cigar princess in parades and at town events in Ybor City and Tampa. My wife's crazy buff grandma took out one of those coffee table books on the Cuban Mafia, and there were freaking circled people in pictures with a bunch of machine guns and cash. And she pointed like, there's your Uncle Diego, and his wife Odalis. Oh, and there's Ernesto. He's such a sweetheart. When my wife's great-grandfather died, they put a block in the sidewalk in Ybor City that said, "Name, our patriarch." They showed that to me too. I love this freaking family. My grandmother had 3 siblings and my grandfather had 6 siblings. They got married, then my grandma's brother married my grandpa's sister. Then my grandma's first cousin married my grandpa's other sister, and then my grandma's second cousin married my grandma's third cousin. So there's no incest, but I have a whole lot of double or triple cousins. That's pretty common back in the day. My grandparents were the same way. It recently came to light that my mom's sister is actually her mother, making my aunt actually my grandmother. I was born in California but had to move to Vegas when I was 9. My mom told me the reason why is because my dad cheated on my mom with a gang leader's girlfriend and put a hit on him. The real reason is much squickier. My dad was constantly cheating on my mom but with his first cousin. Their other cousin found out and wanted to get some with her but she declined. Outraged, the cousin told my dad he was going to kill him. He was not joking. My mom rented a U-Haul and packed everything she could in there and told my dad if he wanted to stay with that bee, by all means, but she's not getting my brother or me involved. He had 2 days to make his decision to stay with my family or leave. He stayed. I kinda wish he didn't since my dad is a huge disappointment. Oof, that last sentence. Understandable though. My 9xGG was Rebecca Nurse, one of the women accused and hung at the Salem witch trials. Also, my grandpa may have murdered his wife, not my grandma. My grandmother dated Bill Clinton in high school. He had a pretty major crush on her. She broke up with him because he was in the band. A relative declined an offer to invest with Henry Ford. He thought it was a fad. Family legend says that my great grandfather had the opportunity to invest in Coca-Cola but his wife tasted it and said no one would ever drink it. I could have been a spoiled brat. Instead I was just a brat. My great uncle was accused of arson and murder and ran away to sea, eventually dying in a knife fight in Shanghai, according to the family story. I desperately want to know more about this, but everyone who knew the story is now dead and none of them wanted to talk about it when they were alive anyway. His sister also led a fairly adventurous but much more legal life and was lost at sea for a while, although thankfully found again. While I don't condone arson, murder, or knife fights, I do appreciate your family's love of the sea. My family claim that one of my great uncles was the first man in Ireland to get run over by a van. He worked the docks in Cork and supposedly got hit by a freshly delivered one. Probably just a family anecdote, but I enjoy the image of a dude pointing at a van and saying what's in holy heck is that there. My family lives on what we call the compound. Essentially they own continuous plots of land. My dad, grandparents, uncle, and cousin all have houses next to each other on the compound. Great for visiting and we had our wedding there, on a river. Dad keeps trying to get my husband and I to join them. Nope. My great grandparents both worked for Thomas Edison, which is how they met. That great grandmother is super badass, too. She came to the States when she was 15 and didn't speak English. Just as the German Depression was getting bad, she had to teach herself English and raise enough money to bring her starving family over from Germany to join her here. She lost all her savings in the US stock market crash and had to start all over, but she did it. We only die in March. Dogs, grandparents, uncles, we all die in March. Beware the Ides of March. My grandfather was the first black aerospace engineer in the United States. My grandma is a North Korean defector. I'm not fully North Korean, just a quarter. My granddad was poisoning my nan's tea with rat poison for ages. She was documenting it and told the police. They did a huge bust on him and arrested him in front of all their kids inc. My mum. In court, he admitted to it. He agreed to all the charges. He did the deed. Eventually the judge, flummoxed, asked, but why, and his answer was because we agreed to it. Apparently, they had made an agreement to use rat poison to home treat her deep vein thrombosis. This brand was basically a blood thinner so the rats couldn't clot when they got injured, and they both distrust doctors. This woman is crazy and I fully believe my granddad's side. Case got thrown out of court. If it's warfarin, it's a good anticoagulant for humans as well as a potent rat poison. My great-grandmother's maiden name was Messerschmitt. Rumor has it that a relative designed the Messerschmitt planes in Germany during the First World War. There's no way to prove it though. And on the other side of the family, my great-great-grandfather's name was James Potter. My great-great-grandfather's name was James Potter. You have his eyes. We recently found out that I have at least 5 half-siblings because my parents decided it would be nice and financially beneficial for my dad to make some donations around the time I was born. Lol, I initially thought you were using euphemisms and sarcasm to say your dad cheated on your mom and had 5 illegitimate children. My great-grandfather had 21 children. I had an ancestor who lied about his age to join up with the Union Army in the American Civil War in 1861. He fought in most of its bloodiest battles, Antietam, Shiloh, and Gettysburg to name a few. He survived all of those to come home to the family farm at the end of the war, where he promptly died of a fever he had picked up in camp. My grandpap lied about his age to join up in World War II. He was 16. The first vehicle he ever drove was a Sherman tank through Africa, then Normandy with heck on wheels. Jack in the Box used to have a clown for the voicer box in the drive-thru, until my grandmother got drunk one night and shot it up after they wouldn't take her order as she walked through. I am both afraid of her and can super relate to her. I have a big butt family. My dad is one of 13. His mom is one of 16. His dad was one of 18. I have 48 cousins. My dad has over 60 cousins. I have over 200 second cousins. Your family needs to work on their pull-out game. My dad's last name is Black. My mom's last name is LeBlanc, French for the white, and they live in Gray County. A kid I went to high school with was half black half white and his name is Grayson. Not that unheard of, but my husband likes to tell people about when he first met my family. He went with me to visit one side, my mother's family, for Thanksgiving and met many of my uncles, aunts and cousins. The next day, we were going to have Thanksgiving on my other side, my father's family. When we walked in the door that next day, he stopped and his eyes got really wide and he loudly whispered, "These are the same people." And I went, "Yeah, I know. Surprise. My mother's brother married my father's sister and my mother's other sister married my father's first cousin." And then if that isn't confusing enough, my grandmother and grandfather were first cousins when they got married. Legal as he was adopted as a teenager. My grandmother said she did this so she never had to change her last name and she was the only girl short enough for him. My grandfather was only 5 featuring 2 inches and my grandmother was 5 featuring. Both came from Canada. Out of their 8 children, including 2 sons, the tallest is one of my aunts at 5 featuring 4 in. Luckily my mother, 5 featuring, married my dad who was 6 feet 2 inch, so we at least have some height in our family. Whoa, I have double cousins too. I love it. It's like having semi-brothers. My great grandfather got in a fight with his sister when he was 12. Said frick this, asked for work on a boat as a cabin boy, got on a ship, and left England. He never went back. We have no idea if that side of the family even knows he survived, but I kind of want to go to the English town and tell my distantly extended family, so you know that little kid in your family history who just sort of disappeared, well, he lived. Surprise. Another great grandfather stole a cannon from China, which my grandfather blew up accidentally with my dad nearby, then left his future descendants a letter telling us, if you still have this last name and go to this part of China, don't mention your name. They might still be pretty pissed off that I stole their cannon. A few generations back a dude got kicked out of Norway for getting his maid and his sister pregnant. When he got to the US he then befriended another guy from Scandinavia and stole his wife. It's funny because part of the family laughs about this, and part refuses to admit it ever happened even though we have proof it did. XD. My grandpa had been visited by Bill Clinton in our small Arkansas town and asked him for campaign donations. Backstory. My grandpa lived in Detroit and ran an illegal casino in a house. He did something for the people who had ownership on it and left town to my small town in Arkansas. The day he died my dad received 2 letters. One from Governor Bill Clinton, another from a senator at the time. At his funeral a man talked to my dad and expressed sympathy for his loss. Said they were good friends in Detroit. Dad never met him ever. He would, every year, visit the grave and add flowers and clean it up. The frick was my grandpa into? I placed my newborn for adoption, open adoption, chose the family myself. A few years later my sister got pregnant and placed her newborn with the same family, so the children are growing up as siblings and are cousins by blood. This was over 20 years ago. My aunt on my dad's side is adopted, and never knew her parents' family. She did one of the DNA tests, and found her biological sisters, who then told her who her mother was, a woman named Shirley. Shirley had been my maternal grandfather's girlfriend late in his life. We all have a feeling that she was dating him to keep an eye on the daughter she gave up 50+ years previously. Pretty sure Shirley also murdered my grandfather after stealing a few $100K from him though. My family is black and a relative tracked down a distant ancestor who was a member of the Daughters of the Confederacy and showed up at the family reunion. Bonus point, the linkage is not a slave being raped by a master but a white woman who ran off with a black man in the 1920s and started a family. I'm a 4th generation paratrooper. All the men on my father's side up to my great grandfather have been to and graduated from the Army Basic Airborne School and have served in airborne units. Probably among the first groups of people to be 4th generation paratroopers. When my great-great-grandfather came to America he took out an ad in the paper for a bride. My great-great-grandmother met him at the docks and they came across together, took advantage of the Homestead Act, and settled in Nebraska. Cool. My grandmother still has the claim paperwork for my family's own homestead from the Homestead Act. My great-grandparents moved from Buffalo, NY to St. Pete, FL and started a hamburger stand that became a small restaurant. One day, great-grandpa woke up my grandfather at 4 AM and said, "Get up. Do you want to be the cook today?" Or the waiter Gramps was confused and asked what he meant. "Your mother ran away with the cook last night. Do you want to wait her tables, or do the cooking? The restaurant went on to local greatness, and Papa eventually found his mother 30-40 years later. The cook had been a poor choice, apparently, so she shacked up with the guy who did bullwhip tricks in a traveling circus. She had a starburst scar on her cheek where he had missed flicking the cigarette from her lips during practice. Papa took care of her financially and visited her until she died. My parents were married within 6 weeks of meeting each other, and they were both engaged to other people at the time. Bonus: my mom was a celebrity, and so was her fiancé. She retired from show business fairly young. He was front page news the day he died. My father is a pathological liar who wouldn't let me be alone with my mother as a child because I would supposedly brainwash her. I just knew he was a liar at a young age and was honest with her. Mom married the next door neighbor and moved to a different part of town. 40 years later my dad still lives next door to my stepfather's ex-wife. Seems like your dad should have then married the now single girl next door. That I am able to look up nearly every family member till about 1,300 thanks to my uncle and his hobby. My grandfather accidentally killed a man. My papa and his buddies were enlisted, but had a night off. They were out having a couple of beers at a bar when he was flirting with a woman. A fellow didn't like that and confronted my grandpa, but he wasn't having any of it since he didn't want to get in trouble should it get back to anyone at base. The guy chased him down outside and sucker punched him, so my grandpa knocked him out. When the guy fell he hit the back of his neck on the curb and snapped his neck. My grandpa say this man lay motionless on the curbside as his own friends tried to shake him awake. Unfortunately my papa and his buddies ran away before the cops arrived. He wrote this in a journal, admitting he should have turned himself in and how much of a coward he was for not doing just that. Lived with the guilt all his life until he died in 1996. My family's time to shine. I think it was in 1997 when my uncle was arrested for the murder of Gianni Versace in Sydney airport because the killer had the same false name as my uncle and they assumed it was him. He was let go after a few hours of dramatic interrogation. My grandmother is on the terrorist watch list of New Zealand because she has the same name as a terrorist. My family apparently has very illegal sounding names, and was almost deported a few years ago when her indefinite leave to remain expired when she left the country on holiday. I was the first baby whose parents were legally changed in the High Court of Wales, Cardiff after being born via surrogacy, so that's something. My wife's family were closely related to a South American dictator in the 1950s. He got kicked out of power and many of them for political reasons came to the States. Many of them carry the entitlement without the resources. For example, one of them, living on SS with not a penny to their name, eschews canned soup and insists on only soup from restaurants at 5 times the price. Another is broke but insists that her husband purchase only new cars because that is what she deserves. It's laughable. My father passed away 2 years ago. I found out he was a Mossad agent for 45 years. Then I found out that my mom was one too. They both knew they worked for the government, but they never told each other what they did exactly. On my mom's side my grandpa is a second cousin of Lee Harvey Oswald. On my dad's side my great-great-great-grandfather was a member of a posse to catch Jesse James and Frank James at the Northfield attempted bank robbery. My great-great-grandfather was king of an Eastern European country for like a month. I don't think he ever actually set foot there, but at least he tried to learn the language a bit. My great-grandmother tried to tell Emperor Hirohito to stop the war in China, but she was instead sent to an asylum in Scotland where she was lobotomized. My uncle is a bigamist and both of his wives were called Susan. One of them was a circus strongwoman and master butcher. A different grandfather was a founding member of the OSS and CIA, and a famous-ish jazz musician. A joke among my co-workers is that I'm the only member of my family without a Wikipedia page. My great-grandmother worked as an organist for silent movies. My father-in-law had polio as a child. He was in the placebo group of Salk's drug trial. My brother is the 3rd generation single-handedly running the family farm. Maybe not so interesting, but city folk like me always are amazed when they find out there are farmers in my family. My grandmother grew up in a portion of Korea that is currently part of the North. Her and her sisters began their escape when the North Koreans publicly executed their grandfather halfway through the Korean War. because he was the spiritual leader of their small town. When escaping, their group stopped along the way when some heavy fighting in the area broke out just north of the now DMZ. Her group hid in a wine cellar for over a week while troops marched above them. Eventually the fighting stopped and Koreans knocked on the cellar door saying the war was over and that it was safe to come out. One by one, every person was beheaded as they left. Only my grandmother survived, as she was young and told to wait for everyone else to say it was safe. For whatever stroke of God's luck, they didn't find her, but she left the cellar, climbing through the pile of beheaded bodies of her friends and family pilled around the cellar doors. Eventually she got to the southern border and married my grandfather, an American soldier. All of my grandparents have similar stories with where they're from and by all rights, they should all have been dead by 30. The fact I exist is a miracle. My grandfather was the first person in Guyana, South America to have a motorcycle, which he died and had one of the biggest funerals at that time. He was in the army. This is the money cat. Like this and in the next 24 hours you'll receive money, or maybe not, but try it anyways. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day you magnificent people.